You've probably encountered someone who says they gave everything to their partner, yet the relationship still ended. Maybe you've experienced pouring endless effort into someone who never seems to match your energy. The truth is, many people confuse genuine love with being emotionally trapped in a one-sided arrangement. There's a fundamental difference between truly loving someone and being caught in what can be called emotional indebtedness. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Our modern culture has created an environment where relationships increasingly resemble business transactions rather than genuine human connections. Think about how we talk about relationships now. We use language borrowed from economics and commerce. We invest in partners, we assess risks, we expect returns on our emotional investments. There's an invisible ledger running in many people's minds, tracking every kind gesture, every compromise, every sacrifice. The underlying assumption becomes that if you do enough for someone, they'll eventually love you back with equal intensity. But this reciprocity often fails to materialize. What remains is a hollow feeling, like being stuck with a debt that can never be fully repaid. This isn't merely a personal psychological issue. It reflects something deeper about how contemporary society has shaped our intimate relationships. Sociological research reveals that our feelings have become entangled with marketplace thinking. Just as consumers take on financial debt chasing an idealized lifestyle, people in relationships accumulate emotional debt pursuing an idealized version of love that remains perpetually out of reach. This represents a new form of romantic suffering, where one person gives continuously while the other simply receives, often without recognizing any imbalance exists. What makes this particularly insidious is that those trapped in this pattern frequently don't recognize what's happening. They keep trying harder, accommodating more, planning shared futures with someone barely invested in the present moment. This doesn't stem from weakness, but from cultural conditioning that teaches love must be earned through sustained effort and eventual reward. Here's the fundamental truth, though. When love transforms into an investment strategy, it's already fundamentally compromised. The more you invest while expecting specific returns, the further you drift from authentic love, which flows freely, spontaneously, and mutually. Consider this an invitation to awareness, particularly if you feel emotionally exhausted, used, or completely drained. The real question isn't why the other person won't reciprocate. It's why you believe you need to pay an ongoing price to receive love. This isn't about rescuing failing relationships. It's about rescuing yourself from the harmful mindset that converts feelings into debts and people into creditors demanding affection. Nobody should exist in perpetual emotional deficit. The emotionally indebted person isn't born this way, but gradually shaped by cultural forces. They learn early that love requires earning it, that emotions need careful management and control, that every feeling represents an investment requiring calculated returns. This thinking pattern transcends individual psychology, emerging where capitalist values intersect with intimate relationships. Over recent decades, feelings have stopped being spontaneous expressions and become performances instead. Business logic centered on effort, reward, productivity, and efficiency has invaded romantic life. People now must market their personalities effectively, manage emotional challenges with maturity, invest consistently in partners, and grow relationships like entrepreneurial ventures. Within this framework, love becomes labor, demanding work that drains continuously but rarely compensates adequately. The indebted individual has internalized this completely. They believe that offering understanding, attention, stability, patience, and future planning will eventually be rewarded with love. They live as if making invisible payments on emotional financing, hoping for returns that never arrive. This construction gets reinforced constantly through self-help narratives, romantic media, and conventional wisdom suggesting that being good enough will change someone, that persistence proves love, that all relationships require effort. The problem is, this creates a distorted equation where the more someone gives, the harder accepting non-reciprocation becomes, since admitting this would shatter the belief that love can be earned through merit alone. The indebted person exists in constant emotional anticipation, trying to anticipate what their partner wants, adapting endlessly, erasing themselves, reorganizing everything to sustain the dream of reciprocated love. But this dream typically exists only in one person's mind. Imagine a bank that extends loans indefinitely, tolerates defaults, increases credit limits, all without requiring repayment. This seems absurd for financial institutions, but describes exactly how many people operate in relationships. Love that should represent mutual connection becomes unilateral concession, a continuous offering of care and presence to someone who never requested it, doesn't value it, and won't reciprocate. The emotionally indebted person becomes an affection creditor, offering everything without guarantees. The unconscious belief operates that more offerings increase the chances of being valued and receiving reciprocation. But love doesn't function as credit relationships do. When it starts operating that way, it's already broken. The partner who doesn't reciprocate isn't necessarily villainous. They might simply be someone who never showed genuine interest, but realizes they receive abundantly while giving minimally. They've grown accustomed to being loved effortlessly, desired without reciprocating, forgiven without changing. For them, the relationship proves convenient, but never truly commits them. Meanwhile, the indebted person sinks deeper because the more they give without return, the stronger their sense of being trapped. Having given so much makes stopping seem impossible. This is the trap. Even worse, this pattern often becomes normalized. The person believes they're simply being understanding or emotionally mature, doing what anyone would do for love. But reality shows they're mortgaging their emotional well-being. They confuse endurance with submission. Deep down, run secret accounting where each gesture gets recorded as credit, every difficult conversation tolerated, every jealousy ignored, every absence forgiven. Everything gets noted, hoping that eventually the other will reciprocate. But this reciprocation rarely comes, and when it does, never matches what was given. This marks the point where love stops being a bond and becomes debt, where relationships sustain themselves not through exchange, but through hope. This is exactly where silent collapse of self begins, the feeling of paying for something never truly delivered. The belief that love will be rewarded over time represents one of modern emotional life's most destructive illusions. Fueled by romantic narratives throughout media and well-intentioned advice, this belief seduces with promises of emotional justice. If you're good enough, endure long enough, give enough more, the other person will notice and reciprocate. But this logic traps people because genuine love doesn't arise from effort, it arises from connection. And connection cannot be manufactured, purchased, or demanded. The indebted person lives in shadows cast by this illusion, carrying hope's weight that never materializes yet prevents leaving. After all, leaving means admitting everything invested was wasted, a pain many cannot bear, so they continue instead. They prefer increasing the debt, renegotiating their boundaries, recalculating expectations. They pretend to build something when actually they're just emotionally surviving a bond that no longer sustains them. This is hope for return operating, an expectation shaped by systems teaching that everything can be achieved through effort, that persistence alone guarantees desired outcomes. But in relationships, this simply isn't true. Love isn't a consolation prize for enduring more pain. It's not a reward for loyalty, patience, or understanding. Love doesn't respond to merit-based logic. It responds to presence. Either mutual exchange exists or no real bond exists. Everything else is fantasy. And this fantasy proves cruel because it makes people complicit in their own suffering. They interpret disregard as distraction, coldness as unresolved trauma, indifference as fear of vulnerability. Everything gets rationalized to protect the illusion that things can still work out, distancing them from reality and disconnecting them from themselves, their feelings, needs, and boundaries. Admitting the other person won't change, won't reciprocate, never truly wanted the same thing would end hope. And without hope, what remains? But here lies the key, because breaking this illusion begins the liberation process. Facing absence of reciprocity without masks helps the indebted person realize they're trapped in debt that was never truly theirs, paying interest on love never actually promised. Emotional indebtedness isn't temporary romantic frustration, but continuous psychological trauma, a corrosive process eroding identity, undermining self-worth, and deeply recalibrating how someone sees themselves and relates to others. The emotionally indebted individual doesn't just feel unloved, but begins believing they're unworthy of love, unless they continue sacrificing themselves. This distortion runs so deep that pain stops being recognized as a symptom and gets confused with love itself. This is where trauma settles, because over time this person learns associating affection with effort, attention with performance, and connection with suffering. They normalize abandonment, rationalize coldness, and idealize others' indifference as puzzles to solve rather than evidence of non-reciprocation. So they cling to relationships that hurt them, believing each disappointment represents another step toward final recognition. Love becomes waiting, endless waiting, eternal, not yet, almost there, just a little more. The consequences devastate with constant anxiety, inadequacy feelings, rejection fears, and depersonalization. The person begins living for the other, regulating emotions based on attention crumbs. Every answered message becomes relief. Every silence becomes anguish. Every small gesture gets overvalued as hopeful signs, when really it's just bare minimum, sometimes not even that. The mind enters chronic vigilance, anticipating reactions, avoiding conflicts, suppressing desires. This is emotional performativity, existing solely to maintain another's affection, even at your own cost. This trauma type proves insidious because it doesn't involve explicit violence. It operates in relationships appearing civilized on the surface, difficult but possible, nuanced, but internally they're environments of psychic exhaustion. The person stays silent to avoid bothering, gives in to avoid abandonment, and silences pain to preserve relationships existing only at their emotional integrity's cost. Effective debt trauma isn't sudden collapse, but slow, constant erosion of everything the person once was. The longer this dynamic persists, the harder escaping becomes, because the indebted individual doesn't just want love, but wants to justify all endured suffering, to prove it was worthwhile, that everything had purpose, that they were enough. But validation never comes, and while waiting, they disconnect from who they were before. They lose their sense of worthiness, desire, and power, becoming merely extensions of someone else's desire. But there is a way out, beginning with a simple yet painful act of recognizing this debt isn't yours, that you're trapped in a structure never meant to reciprocate. The emotionally indebted individual must eventually confront the most uncomfortable truth. The love they sought never existed as imagined. What existed was projection fueled by neediness, idealization, and an emotional system built on merit-based logic, a system convincing them that more giving brings them closer to receiving. But love isn't bargaining. Love isn't reward. Love isn't debt that will someday be settled with a saving gesture. Real love flows rather than demands. It exchanges rather than expects. It encounters rather than invests. Breaking this cycle requires deep internal reconfiguration, recognizing that unilateral giving isn't virtue but self-sabotage. Insisting on someone who doesn't reciprocate isn't resilience, but denial of your own dignity. Eternally adapting to others is, at its core, a disguised way of abandoning yourself. And affection you try earning through effort is, by definition, incompatible with genuinely loving and being loved. Research dissecting effective capitalism's logic shows this relationship model intrinsically links to performance culture. We're surrounded by narratives saying everything is about doing better, communicating better, being more patient, understanding more, demanding less, giving in more. But what these narratives hide is that in many cases, there's no imbalance to correct but rather lack of reciprocity, and no technique can transform disinterest into love. What exists is choice. Continue paying emotional debt never acknowledged, or break with this logic and choose another path. Breaking isn't abandoning love. It's refusing relationship models based on scarcity. It's understanding that loving isn't becoming emotionally indebted for promises that never came. It's stopping justification of others' disinterest with therapeutic discourse, spiritual rationalization, or self-help cliches. Love doesn't need explanation. It's felt, perceived, lived. And if you constantly need convincing yourself it exists, it probably doesn't. And there's something even more important. The individual who breaks this cycle isn't just leaving toxic relationships. They're reconstructing identity outside debt and credit logic. They're learning their worth doesn't depend on others' approval, that their giving needs finding return, and that their capacity to love can no longer be wasted on emotional voids. But for this reconstruction to be possible, a decisive step must be taken. Clearly identify the role you've assumed within relational dynamics. Ask yourself with brutal honesty whether you're loving or functioning as an emotional bank. Recognizing you're not in love but rather emotionally indebted represents one of psychic life's most difficult and liberating acts. Because at that moment, you realize you're not seeking love. You're desperately trying to balance emotional accounting that only existed in your head. The other person owes you nothing. And more importantly, you no longer owe them anything either. This is the breaking point where the debt cycle can finally be closed. But only if you have courage to step out of the emotional banker role and return to being just what you always should have been, someone willing to love, yes, but only if true reciprocity exists. Emotional bankruptcy occurs when the soul exhausts itself, trying to sustain what no longer has foundation. You no longer feel joy, but insist. You no longer recognize yourself, but continue. You no longer receive minimum, but still give yourself. And all this sustains itself through illusion of implicit contracts between you and the other, as if having invested too much makes giving up too late. But the truth is harsh. The more you insist, the deeper you sink. The only way out of emotional debt is accepting the loss, absorbing mourning for what never was, and stopping depositing love where no more emotional credit exists. Exiting this logic requires strength, but not performative strength of immediate overcoming or blind resilience. It requires strength of self-knowledge. It requires looking at yourself honestly and asking what you're trying to buy with this love. Acceptance, validation, security, and even more. Why did you believe you'd only be worthy of these things if you sacrificed yourself first? These questions hurt, but they liberate. Authentic love isn't sustained by debt, constant sacrifice, or long-term emotional planning as if it were high-risk investment. Real love is light, even when requiring effort. It doesn't pressure, doesn't exhaust, doesn't demand pledging your identity. It happens in flow, in exchange, in natural gestures. And if you need constantly transforming yourself to be accepted, then it's not love. It's emotional bargaining. And bargaining isn't bonding, but disguised emotional survival. The way out of emotional bankruptcy begins with symbolic acts of closing the account, stopping recording every gesture, every silence, every frustration, stopping trying to predict what others desire to continue being useful, stopping trying to become someone the other can finally love. Because if love only comes after you destroy yourself, it's not worth it. You're not here to be anyone's emotional ATM. You're not here to function as sentimental loans with exorbitant interest rates of guilt and fear. You're here to live relationships where love is natural, reciprocal, true, and not debt that never ends. If you've ever lived through emotional debt, recognizing your story represents the beginning of healing. Remember that authentic connections exist where love flows freely rather than being calculated, where you're valued for who you are rather than what you provide, and where reciprocity happens naturally rather than being desperately sought.